Algebra II 7.7c, Multiplying and Imaginary Numbers. Okay, wow, we got a big long list of 20 previous videos for Chapter 7 that talks about powers, roots, and complex numbers. And if you haven't seen them, you might become confused during this video. So you know that there's links in this video's description, so you can watch them if that happens, okay? So before we can multiply imaginary numbers or an imaginary number by a real number, we need to express the imaginary numbers in terms of I. We learned in the previous videos 7.7a and 7.7b, those links are in the description, that we can turn a negative radicand into terms of I by factoring. So if we have the square root of a negative 36, we can factor it as the square root of negative 1 times 36. And what's going to happen is that negative 1 right here, the square root of that negative 1, is the same thing as the square root of I squared. We have them split into their own radical sign. When we unsquare this, because we know there's a little 2 root here, and that's got a 2 exponent, what we can do is just have an I times a 6, because 6 times 6 is 36, and we write the I behind the number. So we have 6I. We also learned that the powers of I make a pattern of I, negative 1, negative I, and 1. And any power of I that is a multiple of 4 is going to equal that 1. So they're in order, I to the first power, I to the second power, I to the third power, I to the fourth power, and that's what they equal. So you need to memorize these 4 guys right here. We also learned that the square root of a negative 1 equals I, and that I squared equals negative 1. So we can multiply negative square roots by factoring them as products of negative 1 and using I. Just remember to put an I in the front of the radical sign, but after the coefficient of the radical. If we've got 12I times 2, we just have 24I. That's easy, isn't it? So we need to remember that the square root of negative 1 is an I, and that I squared is negative 1, okay? If we've got the square root of negative 5 times 2I, we can factor this, can't we? As a negative 1 times a 5. If they're under their own radical sign, that's going to help us see that this square root of negative 1 is going to be an I, and we're going to multiply it by the square root of 5 times that 2I. We got an I here and we got an I there. We have 2 I's, don't we? So that means we have 2 times I to the second power times the square root of 5. Because I squared equals a negative 1, that means we have 2 times negative 1, which is a negative 2. So we have negative 2 square root of 5. See? Remembering this is going to help you, okay? So you can write it somewhere on the inside cover or pocket of your spiral or someplace that you'll be able to look at it real quick. Post-it note, something, okay? If we've got the square root of negative 3 times the square root of negative 6, it's really the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 6. So we can pull that negative out. And we know that this square root of negative 1 is an I. So we have 1 here and we have 1 here. So that's I times I, isn't it? And we have the square root of 3 times the square root of 6. That 6 can be factored into a 2 and a 3. And we end up with a 3 here and a 3 here. That means we have 3 squared, doesn't it? Because there's 2 of them. We have 3 to the second power. So he can come out of this radical sign, the square root sign, because he's squared. So that means if we've got I squared, which equals a negative 1, that means we've got negative 1 times the 3 that we were able to pull out times the square root of 2. Negative 1 times 3 is a negative 3, so we have negative 3 square root of 2. See? Really important to have that somewhere really close to you, okay? So we're going to remember that the square root of negative 1 is an I, and I squared is negative 1, okay? So now we've got the negative square root of negative 3 times the square root of negative 7. We can pull the negatives out of the radicand by factoring it as a negative 1 times a 3 for this one and a negative 1 times a 7 for that one, right? We have this negative sign in front of it, okay? So if we pulled it out, we'd have a negative square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3 times a negative 1 times the square root of 7. So we have a square root of -1 here and a square root of -1 here. And we know that that's an I, isn't it? So because of this negative sign here, we have a negative I times the square root of 3 times the square root of 7. And because we have two i's, it's I squared, isn't it? So we have a negative I squared. And I squared equals a -1, doesn't it? 3 times 7 is 21. So because this I squared equals a -1, that means we have a negative times a -1 square root of 21. And there's an invisible 1 here, isn't there? We just don't usually write it. So -1 times -1 is a positive 1. And we don't have to write that one either. We just write square root of 21, okay? If you've got this memorized, that's really going to help you, isn't it? All right, let's try this one. This one looks really confusing. We've got the negative square root of -10 times the negative square root of -10. We can split it up and factor it and make that a -1 times a square root of 10. And the square root of -1 times the square root of 10. But notice that this has a negative sign in front of it, and so does this one, okay? So we know that this is going to be an I, and that's going to be an I, but they're going to have negative signs in front of them, aren't they? And there's like a little invisible 1 there, actually, isn't there? So we're going to have a negative times a negative times the I. And then we've got the square root of 10 times the square root of 10, which is the square root of 100, isn't it? Well, negative times a negative makes a positive. So we've got I times I, which is I squared. So now we've just got I squared times the square root of 100. And square root of 100 is a 10, isn't it? And we know that I squared equals a -1. So now we have -1 times 10, which is a -10. See? When you get really good at this, you'll be able to look at this and say, oh, you know, I know what I'm doing, and you're going to go real fast, okay? Especially if you have these little I guys memorized, okay? All right, our next video is 7.7D. We're going to add or subtract complex numbers. I'm going to add this video to the Algebra II playlist, and there's going to be a link to 11.4a from last year from Algebra I about multiplying radicals if you forgot how to multiply radicals or if you have trouble following this video. And there were 20 previous videos for Algebra II from Chapter 7 that we learned about these roots and about factoring and all of this for the radicals, okay? The powers of roots and complex numbers chapter. So there'll be links to those videos in this description to help you, all right? Just a finger click away, all right? And don't forget, if you want to subscribe to JoAnn School, or if you already have and you want to get alerts for when I'm uploading videos, there's a little bell. There's a little tiny bell in your YouTube app. You'll see there's going to be a little, if you look at, it's not on here, but it's like there's a little bell like right around here on the YouTube video. And if you hit that bell, that turns on the alerts so that you know I've got another video being uploaded. But you can check the playlist that I'm doing too, like when I'm uploading these to the next playlist, to the current playlist, because I upload them to the playlist before I load them to the general public. So you might see videos 2 chapters ahead, okay? All right, we're going to move to the next video. I hope you're doing great. I hope this made sense to you, and I'll see you. Bye.